but as of August 2020, the company is bankrupt in the middle of a pandemic after a bold and highly unusual plan to rescue itself. Shares of the company plummeted to a low of 40 cents on May 26th, but rallied about 1,400% by June 8th, after retail investors began pouring in, betting the beleaguered stock would make a comeback down the road. Decimated by the coronavirus, Hertz tried in mid-2020 to take advantage of this odd spike in its share price and sell stock to pay off its debts. At the time, the company admitted the shares it was selling could end up worthless. Trading was halted on Wednesday, June 17th, and again the following day, after the U.S. Securities and Exchange Commission told Hertz it had issues with its share offering while in the middle of bankruptcy proceedings. The company called off the stock sale on Thursday, June 18th. It is a drastic fall for Hertz, which in many ways was a pioneer of car rental and held the second largest fleet in the business. But Hertz has struggled to adapt to changing times in an industry that is already highly competitive. When it reported second quarter results in August 2020, Hertz said global revenue had dropped 67% over the previous year to $832 million. The company posted a quarterly net loss of $847 million. Much of the strain is due to the dramatic drop in demand resulting from the COVID-19 pandemic. The question is whether Hertz will be able to emerge from bankruptcy in some form, or if this will be the end of its century-long story. Hertz's history stretches back to almost the earliest days of the automotive business. In 1918, a 22-year-old businessman named Walter Jacobs set up a car rental business in Chicago. His initial inventory consisted of 12 Ford Model T cars. Ford itself had been founded only 15 years earlier. Jacobs sold the business to John D. Hertz in 1923. That same year, the company expanded its fleet to 600 vehicles and renamed itself the Hertz-Drive-Ur-Self System. Though he had sold the company, Jacobs stayed on board for about another 4 decades. Hertz's revenues grew to $1 million by 1925. That would be nearly $15 billion in 2020. Over the years, it became something of a pioneer in the industry. It introduced the National Credential Card, a kind of corporate ID card and a precursor to credit cards. It was also the first to open an outpost at Chicago's Midway Airport in 1932. By the mid-1950s, it was the first rental agency with 1,000 locations. Hertz expanded internationally with the opening of a branch in France in 1950, and today it has locations around the world in Europe, Latin America, Asia, Australia, Africa, the Middle East, and New Zealand.
It's been around a long time, and people, when they think about car rental, the Hertz name comes up. That's why I said it's an iconic brand. Even though Enterprise is a larger company, people know Hertz. It's a global brand too. I mean, they have operations globally.
Throughout its history, the company was at times owned by some of the automakers who supply it with many of its cars, including General Motors and Ford. In addition to its international expansion, the company also acquired other names, perhaps most notably the Dollar Thrifty Automotive Group in 2012, in a deal that was worth about $2.3 billion. In addition to renting cars under its own name, Hertz also operates the Dollar, Thrifty, and Firefly brands. As of June 20th, Hertz was one of the 3 major companies that dominated the car rental business in America, which together are thought to control about 95% of the market. One way of determining the size of each company's share is counting the size of its fleet. Enterprise, which is privately held, has about 1 million cars. Hertz, at least until its bankruptcy, had about 500,000, and Avis has about 400,000. How Hertz went from being a pioneer in the car rental business to a now bankrupt company with an uncertain future requires an understanding of its history over the past several years. Sales grew from about $7.6 billion in 2010 to a peak of about $11 billion in December 2014, but have since fallen to about $9.8 billion in 2019. Hertz has gone through several CEOs since just 2014, and each one of them has made big changes.
So a lot has happened over the last, call it 8 years at Hertz. You've had 3 or 4 different CEOs, whether you want to kind of give credit to some of the interim folks. But what you've had is basically a company that needed to redo its fleet, tried to upgrade its IT systems, tried to move the headquarters down to Florida, which they were successful doing, but unfortunately they lost a lot of talented people in that move. So you had some missteps along the way. What you had going on at Avis and Enterprise were management teams that were installed, which were credible, which were kind of battle tested. At Hertz, it was a little uneven.
Mark Frisora oversaw Hertz's acquisition of Dollar Thrifty, which significantly grew the size of the company. The deal increased Hertz's fleet size by about 20% and was somewhat transformative for it in that it added some brands to Hertz's portfolio and gave the company more access to customers renting for leisure, vacations, and the like. In 2013, near the end of Frisora's tenure, Hertz announced it would move its headquarters from New Jersey to Florida. Some investors say that put the company in the difficult position of having to rehire a considerable portion of its workforce, while at the same time losing experienced workers who didn't make the move. In June 2014, Hertz said it would have to restate 3 years of financial results due to a string of accounting errors. A few months later, the company said Frisora would be stepping down. Hertz settled charges by the U.S. Securities and Exchange Commission in 2019 over its inaccurate reporting of $235 million in pre-tax income from the aforementioned period. The company paid $16 million to settle the case. Hertz also sued Frisora and other executives in 2019 to claw back compensation. In August 2020, the SEC said Frisora would pay back $2 million in compensation to settle charges he had aided and abetted the inaccurate disclosures. Around the time Frisora left the company, activist investor Carl Icahn took a stake in Hertz and sat on the search committee that selected Frisora's successor, John Tague, a former United Airlines executive. Tague had a plan to optimize Hertz's revenue in much the same way airlines do, by adjusting rental rates according to when customers book reservations. But Hertz's plan often resulted in more expensive rates than those offered by competitors, costing Hertz market share during Tague's tenure.
I think one of the other things was they didn't have the models, and then their fleet tended to be older than their competitors. So, people don't like to rent cars that are, maybe a few years old with a lot of mileage on them. They don't mind if they're renting it from Enterprise at a local location for insurance replacement.
Hertz then appointed Catherine Marinello CEO in December 2016, and she focused on improving Hertz's revenues. During her tenure, the company invested in upgrading its fleet, building a business in renting cars to Uber drivers, and renting trucks for delivery services that contract with companies such as Amazon. The investments injected some life into Hertz's business, but it also cost money. When the coronavirus struck, the car rental industry was hit hard by dramatic drops in demand.
So when the downturn came and the COVID crisis began, there weren't a lot of parachutes at Hertz for them to grab and to kind of weather the storm. And when the crisis hit them, there wasn't a lot of cushion in the business, and there also were a lot more concerns about the stress that would be on the horizon in the used car market. And I think that anticipated stress maybe drove some of the decisions to move quickly into an organized bankruptcy or try to move faster along those approaches. And when you look across the competitive set, you look at Enterprise, you look at Avis. These were companies that were able to kind of restock their war chest a little bit.
Any business heavily dependent on travel has suffered tremendously during the pandemic. But Hertz's competitors, Avis and Enterprise, are not in the same dire situation that Hertz is in. CEO Catherine Marinello was credited with making investments needed to improve Hertz's top line, such as upgrading its aging fleet of cars. But the catch is that much of Hertz's shiny new fleet is highly leveraged, say investors. The company also spent years upgrading its IT infrastructure. Avis and Enterprise were able to build up cash cushions in the years leading up to the coronavirus pandemic, while Hertz was busily spending on improvements. The company missed loan payments on its cars when customers stopped booking rentals.
When the coronavirus hit, the used car market dried up. People were not buying used cars, and if they were, the prices were very low. all these companies that rely on used cars to pay off their debt, the used car market was not there. So that's what got Hertz into trouble. They couldn't sell their cars. And what few cars they could sell, they were taking a loss on them.
Hertz swapped in yet another CEO in mid-May 2020 in the midst of its attempts to avoid bankruptcy. Paul Stone, a Hertz executive vice president and chief retail operations officer, took the job as the company tried to work out a deal with its debt holders. But these last-ditch efforts did not work. Shares of the company hit a low of 40 cents intraday on May 26th. But the stock shot up to more than $6 a share in the days that followed, as retail investors plowed into stocks hoping to ride a post-coronavirus rebound. Hertz entered bankruptcy on May 22nd after it was unable to come up with the $400 million needed to pay off holders of asset-backed securities. Hoping to capitalize on the spike, Hertz successfully sought approval from the U.S. Bankruptcy Court for the District of Delaware to sell $1 billion in stock. The actual offering ended up being worth about half that, $500 million. But when a company is in bankruptcy, bondholders, not shareholders, are the first in line to get paid. In its own filing, Hertz said the new shares it was offering could end up worthless. In fact, the word worthless appears no less than 5 times in the filing. The company later canceled the plan after some questions from the SEC.
We at the SEC, we're trying to carry out our responsibility in situations like this as best we can. And I expect the other professionals around this situation to carry out their responsibilities as best they can.
In July, Hertz said in a filing it will pay $650 million in installments through December 2020. It will fund this, at least in part, by selling off slightly more than about 180,000 cars. That would be slightly more than a 35% reduction in the size of its fleet. When the company reported results for the second quarter on August 10, 2020, it said it had reduced the size of its global fleet by 29%. In fact, Hertz has already begun selling cars. Prior to its bankruptcy, it sold off about 20 bright yellow 2019 Corvette Z06 sports cars, each for about $60,000. The question is, how much of its fleet can it afford to sell before it endangers its survival? After the company reported second quarter results in August, some analysts said things look a lot less dire for Hertz than they did back in May.
You've seen a lot of the brands survive some turbulent times. You had companies, Hertz, Avis, and Dollar Thrifty, that were all very close to their own demise in the financial crisis and weathered through that storm. You have a company like Budget that went bankrupt after 9/11 and it was then acquired by Avis and has continued to thrive. So what you've seen is you've seen the brand survive. And I want to say Hertz is a brand that's been around for over 100 years. And I'm not going to predict the next 100 years, but I'm going to predict the next 10 years, and I think they will be around. I think what you're seeing with all of the rental car companies, including Hertz, is a pivot in their business.
But its future also depends heavily on when business travel begins to pick up again, something that is still very uncertain. Long-term threats still remain to its business. Ride-hailing apps such as Uber and Lyft have made it easier for people to forego not only taxi services, but perhaps car rental as well. There are also car-sharing apps such as Turo, which threaten traditional rental agencies in a manner similar to the way ride-hailing apps have threatened traditional taxi and limousine services.
There's always going to be a need for rental cars, especially if you're, some of the places you're traveling to. But having said that, some of the car renters are certainly looking at other investments to make in other areas to augment their car rental operations. So it's things like that car renters are looking at too, not just transportation modes, but other technology investments too.
Companies are trying to adjust to a new marketplace where customers have more choices for transportation. Regulations and consumer demand are forcing the introduction of new technology at a rapid pace, whether it be greener powertrains or more high-tech vehicles, even ones that might be able to one day drive themselves. Hertz was unavailable for a comment to CNBC, but should it emerge from bankruptcy, Hertz may be a very different company from the one it became over the last 100 years.